Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are tuning in with us today. My name is Katie McPherson. I am the Director of Professional Development and a Regional Sales Manager for BARC for Schools. We're so honored to have you here with us today. We have two amazing panelists with us that I personally know and trust. And so today we're really going to walk through what physical safety on campus looks like. We have a series of questions that we've prepared on our own, and then we will have some time at the end of the broadcast for you to ask questions as we go along today. If you do have questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat box for us. I'm going to turn it over to our two panelists to introduce themselves, Steve Cardian and Clay Cranford.
Hi, my name is Steve Cardian. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I was a police officer in the suburbs of New York City in Westchester County for 28 years, served in the capacity of motorcycle officer, detective, and sergeant. I retired after there in 28 years, and I got a waiver from the state of New York, worked as a chief investigator for the New York City Department of Investigation, where I did mostly bribery, fraud, corruption, organized crime. After that, I served 5 years as a professional speaker with Campus Speak, traveling the country, lecturing on safety, specifically women's issues, rape prevention, dating violence, date rape, drugs, and the like. After that, I did 3 years with the U.S. Marshals, and I am the author of The New Superpower for Women, Trust Your Intuition, Predict Dangerous Situations, and Defend Yourself from the Unthinkable. And I've been a consultant for the last 15 years to the major media on law enforcement issues and safety.
Thanks so much, Steve. Clay?
Yeah, hi, my name is Clay Cranford. Again, BARC, thanks for putting this together and inviting me. I served in law enforcement for 20 years. I retired as a sergeant from the Orange County Sheriff's Department. The majority of my law enforcement career was working as a school resource officer. I was a juvenile investigator, and I was a member of our countywide behavioral threat assessment team. And now, actually, for the last 8 years, I traveled. I teach behavioral threat assessment. I teach digital citizenship to students and parents, and also to educators and law enforcement on how to keep children safe in a digital world. I wrote a book called Parenting the Digital World. But school safety, really, everything I do really kind of boils down to, equipping students, empowering parents, and helping make safe schools and communities.
Thanks so much, Clay. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Rhonda Beaubier. Rhonda, could you also introduce yourself? You have a vast background in law enforcement as well.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Rhonda Beaubier. Currently, I am the School Success Manager here at BARC. I do have 15 years law enforcement experience, most of which was spent in the patrol division. A little bit of time as a detective in Idaho, and then I was also an officer in Maryland and Oregon. I also did a couple years of elementary education in the classroom in Florida. So my background is both in law enforcement and in schools, which really helps in my current position here at BARC to help schools get on board with BARC for Schools and understand our system and how to use it to help when some of these instances arise. And from there, we will move into our first question. And Clay, I'll go ahead and address you first and have you take a stab at it. And then Steve, you can add on as you wish. So really, we're gonna start off big. What did we learn from our failure of stopping the Margory Stoneman Douglas shooting? What did we learn from failing to stop that?
Well, anybody who's involved with school safety, especially dealing with students who make threats, you really must read the after action report that the commission put together on that whole incident, and specifically look at the threat assessment piece in there. And what we're finding, and this is true for other similar incidents, like we had a very similar thing happen in Arapahoe in Colorado at Arapahoe High School, where you had a student who was a student concern. They did an assessment, a threat assessment, and he still was able to return to the school and kill somebody. And so what we're seeing in both those situations is that both those schools had a threat assessment program, which is good. A lot of schools don't. There were some criticisms about their threat assessment program and their tool and what they were using to assess students, and it was more of a checking boxes and not really doing an investigation and using kind of a skeptical investigative mindset and really digging into what's going on with that student. So a lot of schools are just, getting something off the internet, maybe they're checking boxes, and it's a really kind of a surface oriented assessment. We really need to investigate, and to do that, you need training. And that was the other thing. So there was a lack of training in general. Like, you have to train all your staff, everybody down to the the facility maintenance person on what are the signs, what should we be looking for, how do we do a lockdown, et cetera. But then we have people on a threat assessment team who are permanently on this team, and they're trained how to do a threat assessment, which is a skill. Doing an interview and knowing the right questions to be asking, and to assimilate all that into a general finding of whether this person actually poses a threat, and then what do we do with that person. So both huge breakdowns there, but also we got to manage people of concern, and how do we do that? Because expelling them doesn't throw a magical force field up around your school. In both cases, those students were expelled and they came back to school to commit violence. So teams need to plug in with stakeholders in the community, mental health, social workers, law enforcement. This is a team effort, and this is something that needs to be a curriculum needs to be worked out well before these things happen. And what I'm seeing is, throughout the United States, is that a lot of schools aren't living up to those standards, and that's problematic, right? Because these situations are by and large stoppable because there are obvious signs that someone's on a path of violence, and we have to do that. We got to be thinking differently about the school's role in the lives of students in crisis.
Thank you, Clay. Steve, do you want to add anything to that?
It kind of reminds me of 9/11. It like a big puzzle that which one had pieces of, but nobody was able to really put it together. There were certainly red flags that were missed. The FBI, the sheriff's department, they dropped the ball. And communication and training. Our minds work much like if you visualize something, and the teachers and law enforcement do that. Of course, we do active shooter with simulations, with kids screaming, with makeshift bodies on the ground and bombs, and the more real that the training is, the more efficient and effective we're going to be. And when we think about something, visualization is a big thing in law enforcement. That's what we call it. The military calls it emergency conditioning, whereby you think about what could go wrong in your environment, and then you come up with a plan. And however short that is, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, you come up with a plan, and your brain actually creates a file as if you've lived it. And it helps control the adrenal response. It helps control you're better able to go to something, even if it's not perfect. So therefore, you can operate much more effectively. The adrenal process is a killer.
Thank you both for your thoughts on that question, which also brings up some additional points. And you both talked about training, communication, having something, being prepared, and really working as a team within that school and making sure that everyone is on the same page and knows what's going on. Which brings me to, what kind of training do our police, our school staff, what do they need to prevent and respond to school shootings?
Well, I've done hundreds of threat assessments on our threat assessment team, and I went to a lot of threat assessment schools as a part of that. And what I found was that a lot of the places that you go, they do a good job of kind of telling the theory, and they talk about past situations, and they kind of do case studies, and et cetera. But what I felt was lacking a lot of them was how do you actually do a threat assessment, sitting across the table from another person and engaging that person and asking questions and being inquisitive and being conversational, and then taking that information and then assimilating it into your threat assessment tool, and using that to come up with some kind of judgment on like the level of risk and what are the best preventative options that we have to manage that person. So I mean that actually was that realization, and for going out and doing a threat assessment, I mean it's not easy, and sometimes it's kind of nerve-wracking, especially when you're dealing with a person who can affect the lives of the people that you care about. Because if you're an educator, your coworkers and your students are people you want to protect, and at the same time you also want to help this person because they're in crisis perhaps, or they got some serious mental health issues, and those things need to be addressed too. But so that kind of got me on the path of creating threat assessment training that actually does that. So it needs that you need to have the theory, you need to understand the science behind threats and threat assessments, but you also need like a practical tabletop, or we actually bring in some cases we'll bring in actors to be a subject, and we'll have the threat assessment team after they've gone through kind of all the lecture and all the doing all the practical application of the threat assessment tool. They'll actually sit down and practice it. So when they walk out of that class, they feel like, okay, I have a pretty good idea what this looks like. I know what I need to do. And then they need to get retrained. So if you're a school administrator and you do one, like in Margory Stoneman Douglas, the principal had done one other threat assessment ever. And when he was faced with being the lead person on that threat assessment, Nicholas Cruz, he's like, I don't know what to do. And he punted it to their school counselor when it was really his job to properly, administer do that threat assessment. So you need to get retrained. There needs to be refresher training every year, because it's a skill. And like all skills, if you don't use them, they become dull over time. So, and I like, what Steve was saying, the closer you can get to real life in your training, the better you're going to be at it, especially when it comes to something that's a bit stressful, like doing a threat assessment sometimes.
Thank you, Clay. Steve, do you have some things you'd like to add to that as far as training goes?
Yeah, that's spot on. Exactly what Clay said. We have to have the repetitive process to ingrain it into our nervous system so that we can react to a specific situation. Training once or twice or even 3 or 4 times a year just is not going to get it done. We have to get it ingrained into our nervous system so that it's a reaction. It's an action instead of a reaction, where there's no thought required. One important thing that I think is extremely important in preventing is to have the kids, and I know it's being done, I know you guys are doing it, have the kids and reinforcing them that they're not being a snitch by coming forward, that they're really going to be a hero. If you turn in somebody that's about to attempt to kill 5, 6, 7 people, a whole school full of children and teachers, that's hero work. And I know it's being done, and I think that if you hammer in on that too, because a lot of kids still, especially in this region of the country, the snitch thing is alive and well, and they don't speak up.
Yeah, that was I think one of the biggest findings from the Safe Schools initiative, when they looked at after Columbine. They did a overview of all school shootings. What are the common things that we're seeing here? And one of them was more than 80% of school shooters, there was some other person that knew or had a very good idea that some violence was going to occur, and they didn't tell anybody, and mainly because they're afraid of snitching, getting the other person in trouble, this kind of idea. And the more that we can, kind of chip away at that, code of silence, the better. And a lot of schools are using technology to do that. So using some kind of text-based reporting system where a student doesn't have to literally walk into an office and have that face-to-face experience with an administrator. They can just text it. And as we know, students are less inhibited on their devices. And so this is kind of using that lack of inhibition in a positive way, where they feel less inhibited to share that information. And then, and of course, schools that engage students in various ways, making them part of, a safe school environment is also very important too.
And I think a great example as far as bringing it up, if you, see something, say something. It just as recently as a couple of days ago, it worked in Florida. It stopped 2 kids that were planning a mass attack on a middle school over in the Tampa area. Kids knew about it. They said something, an investigation happened, and luckily, law enforcement, school officials were able to step in and prevent this. So kudos to those kids at that school who did say something and stepped up. They are heroes and they prevented it from occurring. So we're going to move on into our next question. Steve, if you want to address this one first. We've talked a lot about, training, signs, things like that, but we haven't really gone into a lot of what are some of the signs that a student or anyone that could pose a threat to a school or another student, what are some of those signs that they are on that path to violence?
Well, in just every mass shooting that I've looked at, studied, and everyone that I've spoke on in the media, like Clay said, somebody always knows something, and 70+ % of the time they're going to post it on social media. So being in a place to recognize that and to report that, or the service, as Clay mentioned, with the alerts, the texting alerts, somebody monitoring this, looking for those red flags. And red flags were missed in every shooting that I can think of across the United States, from Columbine on up. And to focus on those, and again, going back to, so many, the story was out there, but nobody was able to put it together. And we need more communication, better communication between the schools, law enforcement, the behavioral science people, and anyone that can act as an advocate for safety within our schools.
Thank you, Steve. Clay, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, so yeah, Steve, is hitting on the leakage piece. So because well, first of all, it really starts with a grievance, right? So the people who are actors in mass violence, they at the very core, they have a grievance, and it could be real or it could be imagined, it could be a product of their mental health, or they could have a real grievance, like Evan Ramsey in Bethel, Alaska. This was in the early 90s. He went to school with a shotgun and killed several students, and this really stemmed from him being a victim of bullying, and actually went to the principal and said, I need help, and he didn't get any help. So sometimes they exhaust all their nonviolent options, and they find that violence is an acceptable remedy to their grievance, or they may have a major mental health issue and be imagining what their grievance is. But the bottom line is that they see themselves as a victim, and that there's a sense of loss, there's a sense of revenge. And when you talk to a lot of these individuals, that comes out. It affects their relationships. You have people whose other relationships, they start deteriorating because they're so kind of fixated on this grievance, and they're just very negative, and it hurts them, and it actually causes them to be more isolated, which kind of intensifies their grievances. And then because it's occupying their brain space to the degree that they can't think about anything else, they're just naturally going to leak it out in various ways, whether they're posting on social media, whether they're kind of making offhand comments to friends and acquaintances. Nicholas Cruz was posting images of him killing small animals. He was posting images of him in tactical gear, like having this commando mindset and having a close affinity with past shooters, or with the military is also a sign. And you see that when they start talking about research and planning. You look at their Google search, and they're looking up a blueprint, right? For if they want to commit violence at their school and they don't know how to do that, what do? You go look at people who've done it in the past. So they look at Columbine. How did those people do it? How did Nicholas Cruz do it? And they want to get better than the last person. They want a higher, quote unquote, higher score, right? They want a bigger body count, because that's what is going to get them the notoriety. It airs their grievance, and then eventually, they go and they actually commit the attack, right? So you can see that this isn't something that you wake up one day and just do. it's a complete myth that these people just wake up one day and decide, I'm just going to do this. This is something that's planned and organized over weeks, months, and years, perhaps. So the good news is that because they don't just wake up one day and do this, and that there's observable signs, these are opportunities for us to intervene and get this person some help, and that might include arrest. It could mean mental health hospitalization, or it could mean, giving them, inhibitors and tools and resources to de-escalate them on this path of violence.
So you're kind of hitting on my next question. Once we identify somebody who is a potential threat, because there are all of these warning signs, if we pay attention as police, as friends, as parents, as community members, if we really pay attention to what's going on in our schools and how our children and how our kids are, reacting and doing things on social media and all over the place, it's everywhere now. If we're paying attention to that, what are our next steps when we look at someone and we say, okay, I see some warning signs. I see stuff going on where this could go violent. The kid could go down a violent path. Things are happening here. What are my next steps? What do I need to do to help this person so that it doesn't become the next school shooting? It doesn't become another tragedy.
Well, I think so. Everybody needs to know what to do next, right? So that shouldn't be something that we need to Google and say, like, what do I do next in a situation? There should be a hotline. Whether if you're a student, you should be able to go to an adult at that school, an educator, a counselor, or a school administrator, and say, I have these concerns. I saw this on social media. I heard what my friend said or what this person said. I don't know what it means exactly, but it's concerning. And if your law enforcement has your local law enforcement has a similar mechanism, whether it's calling it in or a hotline or something, then everybody needs to know what that is. So if you don't know what that is, then we need to do a better job of telling everybody and making sure that they do know. And then that's when the threat assessment team comes in and sits down and assesses that individual and determines maybe it was a misunderstanding. I've done so many threat assessments where it was actually a misunderstanding, and we completed the threat assessment and we said there's nothing here. This was maybe perhaps a poor joke, maybe it was just a misunderstanding, whatever. And then we have people who are somewhere between there and actually committed to committing violence. So there's somebody who's struggling, who's maybe they're thinking about and fantasizing about violence in a way of dealing with their grievances or their problems, and that's someone we can get help and we can de-escalate that person. We have people who are acquiring weapons and doing planning, like we have a crime now perhaps, and then we can intervene and force somebody into treatment in that situation, especially if it's a juvenile. So so it all really starts with people looking for the signs, know what the signs are, being a good community member, sharing that with law enforcement or the school, and then the school and the law enforcement actually knowing what to do next. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. Like I said, I've been teaching threat assessments for a while and setting up threat assessment programs for school districts, and I'm surprised in today's day and age, knowing what we know, that not every school and every school district and every law enforcement agency has a threat assessment program and practice and ready.
Yeah, say I was last in the classroom in 2019 and my school did not have anything. So, and that was not very long ago.
No.
Steve, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, anger and victimhood. Clay had mentioned the victimhood earlier. I think most every criminal that I've ever dealt with in my over 30 years in law enforcement, they were a victim of something or multiple things. And I know that the FBI is very concerned about this year coming, that we have a lot of angry people. Their concerns are with hospitals and schools. A lot of people died and their relatives and their family weren't able to see them. They weren't able to see them be properly buried or have a proper service for them. And anybody that had predisposed or had intent to do a school shooting has had a year to fester on that. So apparently the FBI is very concerned about those two entities. And, this next year is going to be a very important year where we have to pay huge amounts of attention to those that we see red flags coming from.
And so with that, with all the things that have occurred in the past couple of years, and just I know from conversations that I've had with some of our schools that do utilize Spark, they're going through so much right now with COVID and angry parents and angry students. And you're right, there is so much anger that's occurring right now. So how has COVID, the distance learning, being separated, everything that's happening with COVID, how has that really impacted our safety and security at our schools?
Well, one of the FBI came out, it was 2019. They went through and looked at dozens or more than 60 school shootings, or actually not just school shootings, but mass shootings in school and out of school. And what they found was that one of the common factors in the lives of the people who committed violence was significant stressors in their lives. So they had 3.6 stressors on average the year leading up to the attack. And when you look at that list of stressors, number one is mental health, and then number two is usually financial issues, and then 3 and 4 is probably like marital relationships and things like that. So what we have, and basically what happens often is if you have so many stressors and then you have very little inhibitors, there's less things in your life that kind of buffer and help you deal with the stress. If those things are kind of gone away and all you're left with stressors and grievances, then you're more likely to be traveling on that path of violence. And so look over the last year and a half, you have, especially students, you have people suffering with mental health. They've largely been isolated, so that if anything, that's going to accentuate perhaps their mental health issues. And then you have the fear and all the things that are kind of cooked into the reason for being stayed at home, et cetera. And then students get services at school because they're seen every day by people who are looking for kids who need help, right? Their behaviors are so obvious in the classroom and how they're interacting with their friends that you're like, hey, we need to pull the student aside and talk to the parents and see if there needs to be some assessment done here. There needs some help. That wasn't available for all our students over the last 18 months. And so what I'm concerned, I wrote an article about this on my website, that I'm concerned that we have kind of this pent up thing behind this dam, of grievances and mental health and all these stressors. And now the dam is kind of broken, and now we're going to be possibly facing a lot of these incidences. So I hope schools are really investing in their counselors and being cognizant that they're having a lot of kids coming to school this year that need help. And the more that we can intervene, the earlier we can intervene, the more likely we are to interrupt, whether it's violence against themselves. We're having kids who are hurting themselves and thinking about hurting themselves at 3 to 4 times the rate than before the pandemic, and also turning that violence outward on others.
Thank you, Clay. Steve, did you want to add anything to that?
Clay said it wonderfully. In the Northeast here, we are seeing a lot of mental health issues, especially with the young. It's very difficult for the parents to have done all the distance learning, and I think there's a lot of frustration both on the parents' part and can be shown on the children's part with their lack of the social interaction that they've been denied for the past year and a half. So again, this will be an interesting year of recovery, and it's one that has to be watched closely.
Definitely. Thank you both for your insights there. So with that being said, we've had a really tough 18 months, right? And now a lot of schools, kids are going back to school. There's so much uncertainty. How can everyone as a community, parents included, how can parents, students, law enforcement, school officials, how can we all work together to make a difference in keeping our schools safe and our students safe ultimately? Steve, you want to go first?
Communication is key. The lack thereof is critical to what we're going to be facing the next year. Law enforcement and the schools, the school resource officers, the juvenile officers, they're a great resource. They're like the kids, in my experience, they're like the kid's best friend in the police department. And one of the best schools, I did a segment on active shooter in New Jersey, and not that every agency could do this, but they had 3 SROs in this school in New Jersey, and they had a police car in the front and a police car in the rear. And not only were they SROs, but they were tactical officers, and they had secreted within the school, locked up, of course, very securely, weapons that they could call upon in a time of need. And the communication, creating a good plan of action. In New York State, every school has had to submit to the governor's office a plan of what they're going to do in an active shooter situation. So communication is a big key, big key.
Thank you, Steve. Clay, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I think Steve's 100% correct. I mean, communication, and you can see in this slide, it's really, we have these 3 different entities: law enforcement, school and students, and parents, all kind of working together synergistically to keep that community safe. So students see things happening on social media that parents or law enforcement or the parents aren't seeing, and so they need to be encouraged to be part of that safe school community, to share that information, and we, like I said, come up with ways where they feel like they can do that openly, or they can do it confidentially, perhaps in a way that it doesn't feel like they're snitching on a friend. And then the SRO piece, I couldn't agree with Steve more. I was an SRO for years, and the relationships that I had with the students on the school was key. I had many students walking up to me and saying, "Hey, Deputy Cranford, this is what's going on," or they sharing that text to tip information would go to me as well as the school administrator, and having somebody there. Every morning I'd stand on the steps, students walking into school, and I'd look every student in the eye and say good morning, and that along with the school administrator standing next to me, and having that kind of presence there, not only perhaps alert us to students who are coming to school and maybe needed some attention, need some help, but also having the other students feel like this is a safe place for us. And I want parents also to be involved in this, to encourage their students to share this information with school if they see things that aren't safe. But moreover, like I want parents to be a part of their child's digital world. So I want, and that's a big piece of what I do. I talk to parents about this. My book speaks to this, Parenting Digital World. But I want parents to understand what's happening in their child's digital world, because I've had parents find out these things and give us that information when their student was afraid to. So parents are such an important piece to all this. All these working together, we're going to have a much safer school environment for sure.
Definitely, I agree. I think, communication between all of us is how we get things accomplished. And if you're not communicating with our kids, if we're not communicating with law enforcement, school officials, everybody has to be involved in order to keep us all safer. That's the only way it's going to work, is if we communicate with one another. Katie, can you move to our last slide? And we're going to talk just a little bit about conditions of readiness, states of readiness, and kind of if Clay or Steve, whoever wants to go, kind of explain a little bit what this means and kind of where most of us end up living, and when things start to happen, how we move along this.
Well, condition white would be you at home with your doors secured and locked, sitting, watching television, where your heart rate is normal, you're not on alert. Condition yellow might be that you're among strangers, that you're out in a shopping district where you want to pay a little bit more attention to what's going on. So condition orange too, then you're about ready to go hands-on, that there is a threat that you're dealing with. Condition red would have that you're onward, you're getting on with some sort of violence. And what happens to the body is that at 114 beats per minute, you lose your fine motor skills, and that could be unlocking a car door, writing. I've seen moms that weren't able to dial 911 when their child was having a grand mal seizure. And then upwards between 115 and 145, you lose your complex motor skills, which require more than one movement. You see this typically in some of the martial arts that are out there. And between 145 and 175, our gross motor skills seem to kick in very well. And if it goes above 175, and here's where the training comes in, you go into the frozen zone. And this is what we see in many active shooters, where the person literally has to be dragged out of where they are to safety, because they've gone into just what it is, the black condition black or the frozen zone. So again, that's where the training comes in. I had gone right after Virginia Tech. Inside Edition brought me to a college here, and they said, what can we do, Steve? And it was an interesting social experiment where I picked a volunteer in a law class of 30 kids. And it was regarding, of course, what Cho had done going into the classroom. And I took him out and I gave him a fake gun and I said, go inside, wait a minute, walk right in, say whatever, tell them that you're ready to do battle. And then I went to the kids in the classroom and I said, listen, collectively, you as a unit, you as a team, you go for the gun, go for the gun, go for the gun, neutralize the attacker. And they did. We did this about 5 times. And each time the shooter said that he couldn't have gotten off more than 1 or 2 shots, and he had no idea, because he was so sensory depraved, where those shots were going. So even training like that with the realism, with the children, preparing them, I think is very unique in of itself.
Very much so. Clay, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Steve nailed exactly what each one of these states are. I just want to maybe add one little piece, is that when because this is a slide from my class that I do for educators on preventing school violence, preventing active shooters. I want, when you're on campus and you are, a school supervisor, you're out there doing your lunch duty, whatever. I want those people in condition yellow. I want them relaxed and alert, right? Ready to respond. And then when they need to respond, then they start moving into orange, of course. So what we don't want to be is we don't want to be trapped in condition white, and that's people walking down the road with their head in the clouds and not really aware of what's happening around them. So when we're on duty, whether it's law enforcement or you're on duty as a school supervisor, we need to be in condition yellow, and then we need to know what to do if we need to go to orange. And what I've seen, I'm sure Steve has seen as well, you resort to your lowest level of training. If you're trained to do nothing, that's probably what's going to happen. And people quickly go from fight, flight, and quickly to freeze, and that's condition black. And that is, and I've seen it actually happen with people in law enforcement as well, people who are trained. So the more we kind of preload, whether it's you thinking like, hey, I'm on lunch duty right now. If we had someone coming in here with a gun coming from this area, what would I do now? Would I move my students to another, like whatever. You just come up with scenarios to help you kind of digest these ideas. And then if we can do training where we can kind of move you into a condition orange, feeling, just a little stress inoculation, then you're more likely in those situations to perform where you're not going into code black.
Thank you very much for your thoughts there. I just wanted to add, with my background, I've done both, a lot of training with active shooter type things. And one of the things that I did when I was an officer in Idaho is we engaged some of the schools, and we had an active shooter simunition where some of the teachers took place, and officers came in and they participated in what an active shooter event would really be like, role players being the bad guy coming in and having that violent attack, what the teachers would do, how they would react, how law enforcement would react, coming in, clearing. I think all of the teachers that took part in that really took something away from it. However, we never do it enough. And I think that that is something that we should all take away from this, is one time isn't enough to really know how you're going to respond if it were to ever happen to you. You can't just do it once and consider yourself trained. It has to be something that is continuous, is ongoing, that you're ready for. Because if you don't keep up that skill on how you're going to respond to something, when it happens, you're going to go to condition black, and that's not where you want to be.
We tend not to respond well to new stimulus if we haven't been exposed to it, like an active shooter, like a blitz assault from behind that you don't see coming. So great points, very important. The continuing ongoing training is critical.
All right, well, thank you both. Katie, do we have any questions from our attendees?
I don't see any questions from our attendees right now, but I actually wrote down a couple of questions that I was hoping could be addressed. My first question is really about, I do a lot of work with suicide prevention, and when I was looking through the Secret Service 2021 report, I believe, I was surprised that that 78% of school shooters actually have had some ideation or an attempt. And so I don't know if either one of you have experience with that, but as we look at suicide rates in most states rising amongst youth, I'm just curious as to your thoughts in that kind of trajectory of grievance. Are you seeing kids that don't necessarily have a grievance but are desperate in suicidal ideation also activating like that?
Well, so we've had students that were showing signs of suicidal ideation, or they were suicidal gestures, this kind of thing. And then they would, they get interviewed by their school counselor, and then while they're getting interviewed, the school counselor is realizing, there's something more going on here, that there's a grievance or something else kind of wrapped up in this. And then the threat assessment team would come in and interview that student and find out that that the suicidal ideation is really more of a feature of their path of violence, as opposed to they're just depressed, they want to hurt themselves. Now they're thinking, well, I want to hurt someone else too. That's typically not what happens. So let me back up. So if someone's depressed and for various reasons, it could be biochemical, it could be all, taking drugs, it could be a bunch of different things, and they're having thoughts of hurting themselves. That doesn't make them more likely to want to hurt someone else. So merely having these thoughts of self-injury statistically does not make you more likely to hurt someone else. But when we have someone who's on a path of violence, they realize at some point that that they're probably going to die as a product of carrying out this attack. And so we do see kind of gestures and things that you might see in somebody who's thinking of killing themselves, like making amends, talking to people, giving things away. So some of these kind of gestures that we would see someone who's thinking about hurting themselves or killing themselves. But it's more of a chicken and egg situation. So if they're thinking of being on a path of violence, you may likely see suicidal ideation because, again, they're like, I'm on this mission and I'm not going to make it. Like, to carry this out, it's more important than my life. It's okay for me. That's kind of what their thoughts are, as opposed to someone who has depression and is thinking of hurting themselves. That person's not more likely to hurt others. So they're kind of two different situations.
Okay. Steve, do you have anything on
that? Clay covered it well. I don't have much to add to it, other than in some of the teen suicides I have seen, we have also seen the possibility that they could have been violent, because they showed a lot of violence in their past.
Yeah. You talked a lot about models of threat assessment. If a school does not have a plan currently, where should they look for? Is there a national threat assessment model or several that you would point them to?
Yeah, there's a bunch out there. I would encourage them to go visit my website, cybersafetycop.com or threatassessment.com, and take a look at the threat assessment model that I'm using, which is based on the latest research, best practices. There's other threat assessment models like the VSTAG, the Virginia Student Threat Assessment. I can't remember now what the last one is, but that one's also widely used. And but whatever a school decides to do, just don't make the mistake of downloading, because you can just find a PDF of some threat assessment, worksheet, and downloading that and throwing your logo on it for your school and saying, this is what we're going to do now. It's much more complicated than that. There needs to be kind of a procedure, a logarithm for doing these things, and then the people need to be properly trained. And of course, you want to be using a model that's been kind of verified. VSTAG's gone through scientific validity tests. My threat assessment model has been reviewed by the Secret Service, a National Threat Assessment team. So you want to make sure that you're using something that's going to be helpful, not too complicated, because it needs to be something that a school administrator could use, but something that's very comprehensive and fully featured, so that you find out what you need to know about that person of concern. So it has to be usable, but also featured enough that it's helpful.
Awesome. There is a question in the question box. How can a school receive threat assessment training?
I'm sorry, how can schools receive threat assessment training? What was the question again?
How can a school receive threat assessment training? Like where do we find people like you? I mean, we obviously have you too.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, visit my website, cybersafetycop.com, and use the contact form. Let me know what you need, and and again, the Virginia State model is something that's VSTAG. I would just Google that. You can find their website. There's a couple others I can't think of off the top of my head, but basically, when I do my threat assessment training, it's a one-day class. I found that doing anything more than one day is kind of tough for school administrators and their staff. So we do a one 8-hour day of training, and then which includes all the lecture, the practical app, and then the scenarios. And then every year we need to do a 4-hour kind of refresher, and that could be, and that's typically more of again, kind of a practical application, doing scenarios and things like that. But everybody who's new that comes onto the team, they need to get the full 8 hours. And what's unfortunate is that a lot of schools they'll just kind of give them the forms and say, here's the manual, read this, and we'll just do it together. That is not something that's defendable. And unfortunately, you can do a threat assessment, you can do everything right, and that person can come back and commit violence. And you want to be able to say, we did everything we're supposed to be doing correctly. You want a defendable best practices program.
And I would like to add to join us in October for our webinar on threat assessment for a little introduction into some things that you can also do.
Yeah. And Rhonda, I wanted to throw it back to you, since you work so closely with our clients just on setting up, what BARC is, what BARC Plus is, for those people that are on the call that aren't BARC clients, maybe just like a, elevator speech about who we are and what we do and how it relates to what we've talked about today.
Yep. So BARC and BARC for Schools, really, when it comes to the Margory Stoneman Douglas incident, it's pretty close to us, because that is one of the reasons why our CEO of BARC decided to turn BARC for Schools on for free for all schools across the US. So if you have nothing in place that is monitoring and looking at your students' G Suite accounts or 365 accounts, Bark is an excellent option because we're going to look at anything in that Google Drive, Gmail, Google Docs, scanning that for any signs of violence, self-harm, suicidal ideation, bullying, various different topics. We're going to be looking at that information to see if there are anything that is concerning and alerting the school personnel to that so they can look into it and really kind of start that process of what's going on here. Is this an issue? Is it something that we need to look further into? Or is this just kids being kids? Same thing for those 365 environments. We're going to look at Teams, your OneDrive, and Outlook. So for that email, and again, looking for those same types of things. And that's on our free version. With our enhanced paid version, we're also going to make phone calls when we do detect an imminent situation. So a child that is talking about committing an act of violence against the school or another student, or a child that is talking about, self-harm or writing a suicide note in Google Docs, which happens way more often than I think school personnel or really parents, anybody knows or understands. Kids go in there and they write and they journal, and we find that kind of stuff, unfortunately, all the time. When we do with our paid version, we would make that phone call to the school personnel who's assigned to receive it, and make you aware that there is an imminent situation with a student of yours that needs to be looked into as soon as possible. So that would be my short elevator pitch. If anybody has questions, you're welcome to reach out to myself or Katie. Love to walk you through a demo and give you more information as far as how we can assist with that safety and security piece for your school.
Yeah. Well, just to wrap up, a couple resources I wanted to throw out. Steve and Clay are always available. We are going to have next month a threat assessment webinar. It's our Great Reset webinar number 3. And then we are launching some professional development courses. One of them is how to maximize your SRO and the role that he or she plays on campus, which involves everything we've talked about today, including the threat assessment piece. And then on the front of students, the work that I've done as a former school administrator and just continue to do in my own community speaks to being a trusted adult. I think what I continue to hear from kids is relationship, relationship, relationship. If I trust you, I will tell you anything and everything. There's this weird dance that parents are doing, myself included, with devices. Like if they're in trouble, you take the device away. Sometimes they're trying to tell us something that is on the device about a classmate, about a friend. Some of our reactions as parents sometimes are, I'm taking your phone, which is your support and lifeline, and you can't hang out with that person because they must be a bad kid. And I think we need to really take a keen look at what our kids are trying to say to us. And in that lens, I came across a resource called Safe UT, which is an app out of the state of Utah. It's been in place for about 5 years. I'd highly recommend, if you're a school, to look at it as that anonymous reporting mechanism. On one side of it, it's an anonymous tip reporter. It's anonymous until it can't be, meaning if they have to breach the URL for an imminent situation, they will, and the kids and parents and teachers are all educated on that. On the other side of it is the text crisis chat app. So the kids have 24/7 access to a clinician. So it serves both purposes, that anonymous piece that kids want to report serious stuff, and then on the other side of things, like I just want to talk to somebody and I don't want it to be my parent necessarily, don't want it necessarily to be a teacher or administrator. So I found that to be a great resource. I'm rallying really hard to bring it to the state of Arizona. We also have a partnership with Sandy Hook Promise. They have the exact same type of anonymous tip line called See Something, Say Something, which is free. So I just encourage you, in this day and age with social media, our students are our first responders. They know well before we do what is happening with classmates and friends, and we just aren't there yet in 2021 where they feel comfortable in some situations coming forward. And so I feel just so deeply for them. The age of social media is a really really tough thing for some kids. And so just encourage you to share the responsibility as parents and community members and stakeholders. And just really want to thank Steve and Clay for being here, straddling East Coast, West Coast, and time zones. And just your expertise is so needed. So please continue to do the work you're doing. We're really honored to have you here today. And thank you, Rhonda, for your moderation skills and expertise as well.
Thank you,
You're the
Katie.
safety wave of the future.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. And we will send out a recording of this. So for any of you that want to share with your colleagues or parents or anybody, we will have a recording out in the next 48 hours for you to share. And please feel free to call on us at any time. Rhonda and I are here, as well as Steve and Clay. So hope you have a great mid-morning and afternoon wherever you are. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Thanks, guys.